Hi everyone. Here is our weekly week in review. This time on week 4, or our unit that I called Hinduism Part 2, but which I also could have just called Yoga. So our discussion this week really touched on so many important themes. I'm just going to try and call out a few of them, do my usual shout outs, and then, like usual, wrap up and talk about next week. So, one thing that came up a few weeks ago initially during our unit on indigenous religions was we started to talk about the impact of colonialism and what it does when you have the imposition of one culture's norms, whether it's political or economic or religious, onto another culture's, right? And many of you had great examples about what happens or what happened. For example, here in what's now the US, we talked about Native American traditions and how these different Native American nations really had to cope with this incredible disruption and really this attempted um, genocide of everything that they were. This week, this comes up in our discussion of yoga, but the dynamic is a bit different because we have some different conceptions um, about what constitutes quote unquote normative yoga. Is it what we read about in the Yoga Sutra? Is that some quote unquote authentic or real yoga? Um, what do we make of what we find at our local yoga studio here in the US? No matter where you are. Um, for example, if the instructor uses a lot of Sanskrit in terms of naming the asanas, like the different poses, or if they use Sanskrit mantras, does that make that studio or that class or that teacher somehow more authentic? If so, why? And if not, then why not? And I feel like when I read through the post this week, I really see everyone grappling with these key issues. Um, so now for some specific examples. So Stephen wrote, as as he said, it's part of maybe a TED talk, and I said maybe a TED post in this extended discussion how yoga is different in the U.S. and India. Stephen wrote, quote, that America has taken too much from other cultures that they regard as sacred, only for us to convert it into something completely different and not sacred at all, unquote. Um, so, this made me think about cultural appropriation, that then in turn leads to consumerism, and that is in and of itself simply another form of resource extraction. So under this kind of rather cynical view, then, you know, the US, or not even the US as a political nation, but culturally speaking, we're going out and we're mining for cultural resources from other places, and then we're bringing them here, and then we're repackaging them, and then we're selling it. And that certainly is one, again, like sort of cynical view of what's happened with yoga. At the same time, it's not as if Indian yoga teachers are not wise to this game and are not positioning themselves to benefit from it. Um, if we look at the way that yoga retreats and other like yoga teacher trainings are marketed to people in Europe and North America and really all over the world, you can see the way that you have these schools of yogic um, practice in India that are positioning themselves as sort of this font of spiritual wisdom, of authenticity, and they know that there's a market for that. And, like these people live in the world, they have to eat too. So if they can draw in these students from all over the world, then what that's what's happening, and it helps these schools then to be more and more successful. Also, I wanted to mention that places I've heard of so many yoga retreats and teacher trainings in places like Bali, which is an island um, in Indonesia, and even like Mexico and Puerto Rico, Costa Rica too, um, that there are certain locations that are really quite far away from India, but where there's like this combination of come to a yoga retreat, it's in a beautiful place, um, and you'll have this like spiritual awakening, and it's all kind of nicely packaged, and that packaging is something that we can really analyze, and I think that we should. Um, Moving on to another shout out, Kimberly raised this great question, um, specifically talking about the article I posted by Lane and Lane, which was critiquing and analyzing the court case in California about the teaching of yoga within public schools. And Kimberly mentions, or she says, quote, if it is a religious act, then why should schools be able to do it even if they take away Om and other religious words from it? If they won't allow that for other religions, then why is it okay for yoga, unquote. And I responded to this in the discussion thread, but I wanted to bring it up here too because I thought it was such a great question that the teaching of religion in public schools is just such a hot button topic. We have this establishment clause in the First Amendment that says that basically one religion cannot be established above all the others, and this was what the judge kind of ruled in the case in California and the article by Lane and Lane, that basically because yoga was drawing on three different roots, right, with Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, that it necessarily could not be relying on one religion. So the teaching of yoga was then necessarily not a violation of the Establishment Clause. And now, as someone pointed out, I think it was hold on, I'm going to give credit where credit's due. So as Lisa then mentioned in response to Kimberly's thread, that had the court looked deeper and taken time to fully understand the roots to yoga and the misappropriation of another's religious beliefs, there very well may have been a different decision. Though, of course, as Lisa said, we can't be sure. So all of this is to say that we have a lot going on, like in that court case. We had the debate about the Establishment Clause, and we had the debate over teaching of religion in public schools. I mentioned in my response to Kimberly that we have this question about the inclusion of the phrase "one nation under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. But I've also thought about the debate over which holidays we officially celebrate. Um, so, for example, in December, why don't we have school all the way up through the end of the calendar year? Because we are implicitly celebrating Christmas. Why do we have spring break? Hint, it's not exclusively so that college students can go to the beach, although that happens to be a natural consequence. No, it's because we are also implicitly celebrating Easter. Why is our weekend in this country on Saturday and Sunday, whereas in other countries it's on Friday and Saturday, and so on? So when we think about holidays and how we structure our institutions, whether it be public schools or whether it be our colleges or even just our our weekly schedule, we get to see places where it's not so easy to differentiate between religion and culture. And as I like to phrase it, this leads us to ask some wonderfully impossible to answer questions, or just unanswerable questions, about the degree to which we can distill religion from culture and vice versa. And we're going to keep coming back to that theme of how religion and culture are really hard to differentiate. Jordan had a great point, um, writing that, quote, exercise-based yoga in the West trends towards commodification and the strengthening of connection to body image and physically attractive attributes as well as ego structures. In essence, this is in direct opposition to the original teachings of yoga, unquote. I thought this was a really important point, that these two forms, yoga and, Jordan wrote about yoga with a small y and yoga with a big Y, can be seen as having directly competing aims. So if the emphasis is on the external form, i.e. the body, then that necessarily takes away from focusing one's attention on the inner form. And at the same time, I feel like a lot of yogic philosophy tends towards unifying the body and the mind. So after all, Descartes' famous, "Hoc cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am, which is such a huge part of sort of this Euro-American move towards dividing up the body from the mind. Um, we don't, Patanjali wasn't thinking about that. Patanjali was thinking about how do we use the body, which is part of the mind, and vice versa. How do we mesh them together? How do we do the yuj, as James Mallinson said in that one podcast, right? The yuj, which is the root meaning of yoga, yuj, which is to join or to yoke. right? Like we yoke together two oxen to plow a field, right? Um, so what happens if we don't have that impulse to unuge them? This raises some more really, really great questions. In conclusion, I wanted to, in order to keep this short, turn from Hinduism to Buddhism, which is what we do this week. In this coming week, we turn to Buddhism. So we'll find lots of similar vocabulary terms like karma and samsara. A lot of the vocab will still be in Sanskrit, but we'll also have some terms in Pali, which is another very old Indian language. So, for example, in Sanskrit, you have dharma, and in Pali, that shows up as dhamma. And so you'll get used to it, I think, pretty quickly in the reading. A great question for us to consider is how Hindu and Buddhist teachings on these terms and these concepts differ from one another. So one example of a key difference is on the presence or lack thereof of the soul or the self. So in Hinduism, we have the concept or the notion of the eternal Atman, which means self. And then in Buddhism, we see this concept of anatman or no self, um, and to think about how that works within this teaching of karma, of samsara, of reincarnation, and getting to some type of release. So with Hinduism, right, we had moksha, and with Buddhism, we think of it more in terms of arriving at a place of nirvana. I've also assigned a wonderful article by Jose Capizan that reevaluates some interpretations of Buddhist teachings on gender. Specifically, he's writing about Mahayana teachings. So as you'll learn this week, we have Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana, just to kind of keep it simple. So Capizan is only talking about one school of Buddhism. And you'll be able to access that article on perusal. And I hope to interact with you there and to raise some more great questions. So thanks again for all of your great work this week. I look forward to seeing you, quote unquote, on the discussion threads. And yeah, please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.